one of the things that seem to have affected a lot of people because of the extensive and intensive Zionist propaganda for decades, that Jews were the original inhabitants of Palestine and they're simply recovering the land of their ancestors, and as such Muslims and possibly Christians are just invaders. They're just recovering the biblical land promised to them. This is false on theological and historical basis, in addition to international law. It is false theologically because even a Christian, a Jewish rabbi like Rabbi Elmer Berger, in a booklet of his, shows that when the Bible even speaks about the land promised to the descendants of Abraham, he admits that Muslims also are descendants of Abraham. It's not only the Jews, number one. It is unsound historically because when the Israelites, as the Quran describes, went after persecution in Egypt led by Moses, they did not enter a land that was empty. They were the Canaanites living there. When Christianity came, some of these same Canaanites became Christians. When Islam came, some of the descendants of those Canaanites became Muslims. There was no invasion as such. In other words, they're not an implanted body. There are people who existed there and lived before Jews set foot in Palestine. And they happen to be now Muslims or Christians. So historically it is not sound. Again, in terms of international law, you get a situation where terrorism, real terrorism, that was the initial introduction of terrorism in the Middle East. When Palestinians were terrorized and massacred, and there are numerous massacres, the famous Deir Yassin, when Begin, the former prime minister of Israel, was a party to that, entering a village, a Muslim village, gathering at dawn time, very early morning. All men, women and children, 248, as reported by a neutral observer from the Red Cross, and mowing them down. And this is only one example of that terror that was inflicted on them to drive them away from the land and declare a state in the land that doesn't belong to them. So on all perspectives, a great deal of injustice has been done to the Palestinian people, and the so-called peace process or peace agreement did not really provide the full rights or even close to reasonable rights to the Palestinians. It excluded those who were driven away in 1948, in 1956, in 1967, and these are the bulk of Palestinians. By what right would somebody who was born in Russia as a Jew all his life have greater claim in the land that belongs to a Palestinian who is driven away, and now the peace process, so-called, does not allow him to return to the land of his ancestors or to recover his property? What kind of justice and what kind of international law? And why should international law be interpreted and applied in such unfair and partial way?
By World War II, by 1947, we have a letter from the chief rabbi of Jerusalem that he sent to the United Nations in Lake Placid. And we have this on our site. This is from Rabbi Dushinsky. He was the second chief rabbi of Jerusalem, the leading rabbi of Jerusalem. Nothing to do with the rabbinate. It has to do from Zionists today. Again, we don't recognize the Zionist state. We do not recognize their rabbinate and so forth. But the rabbi who was the head of the Jewish community at the time in 1947, his name was Rabbi Dushinsky of blessed memory, Yosef Tzvi Dushinsky. He wrote a letter to the United Nations, one of many letters. He begged them, he said, I am the leader of over 60,000 people in Jerusalem. We do not want to be, that he realized it was a fate completely, that they were going to create a state of Israel. And he said, we do not want to be included in the state of Israel. Now this may be shocking. It should be shocking to anybody who hears this, because here is the chief rabbi of Jerusalem. He says, my whole community has over 60,000 people, and they do not want to be included in the state of Israel. What is going on here? You know, if state of Israel and Zionism represents Judaism, which everybody in the world thinks today, how could it be that the chief rabbi of Palestine, of Jerusalem, the one who leads the whole Jewish community, does not want to be part of this state of Israel? He wants to be with the Arabs. It's because the question is the answer. This just comes to show you how strongly Zionism and Judaism is, in contrast, is totally diametrically opposite. Zionism, as I say, is godless. It is ideology that is a nationalistic ideology, a secular Nothing to do with religiosity, with Judaism. Totally the opposite. Unfortunately, our voices at that time, Rabbi Dushinsky's voice was totally, his appeal to the United Nations was totally ignored, even though who should be heard when they're speaking about how they should divide the land of Palestine? Not the indigenous people, the Palestinian majority, which was the Muslims, and the Jewish minority, the Jewish populace who were living there. They were all ignored. Whose voice was heard? The Zionists who were closely connected in Europe with the leaders of Europe. These people were considered the de facto representatives of the Jewish people and the Jewish religion, even though it is preposterous. It's unbelievable, because these were non-religious Jews. It's like saying that you will take some atheist and they'll take him up as the Pope, and he'll be the representative of Christianity. I mean, it just doesn't make sense.
But that the state of Israel itself should not even exist in the first place. What you may find more shocking is that the person saying that is a rabbi. He is Yisrael Weiss from Jews United Against Zionism. Rabbi.
Yes.
Pretty strong words.
Yes, but this is the view that was shared by all religious leaders throughout, the last 100 years, when the whole movement of Zionism was created. The concept, the ideology of transforming Judaism from spirituality, a religion, into a materialism, a nationalistic goal to have a piece of land. All the rabbinical authorities said this is antithetical with what Judaism is all about, expressly forbidden in the Torah, because we are in exile by God.
So you shouldn't have a state. You shouldn't have a country. You shouldn't have a government?
We shouldn't have a state. We should be living amongst all the nations as the Jews were doing for 2,000 years, as loyal citizens, people who are serving God, emulating God with compassion. And the Talmud states clearly that if we will attempt to breach these oaths of God, of trying to leave out God, it will just bring to this death and catastrophic results for the Jews. We find that since the inception of Zionism, the state of Israel, there's an endless river of suffering for the Jews and non-Jews alike. And contrary to what people believe, that there's a religious conflict, we have been living for hundreds of years amongst the Muslims and Arab communities without any UN human rights groups to watch.
So let me ask you this, Rabbi. Was life better for the Jews prior to the creation of the Jewish state of Israel?
100%. In Palestine, we have the testimony of the Jewish community living there and other lands, that they were living in harmony, and they pleaded with the United Nations. In the documents we have, the Chief Rabbi of Jerusalem said, we do not want a Jewish state. The Muslims, Christians, and the Jewish inhabitants were ignored with the creation of the state, this political
Nevertheless,
state.
you might not have had a country per se, but you were not a stranger to being abused or slaughtered over the millenniums, right? And particularly as recently as 50, 60 years ago.
There is an issue of being killed because of anti-Semitism, and then there's another issue where you antagonize and you create your anti-Semitism through Zionism. Doing that, in other words, it's not a free-for-all. You'll knock out your neighbor's windows and then yell anti-Semitism.
All right, now I know you are an Orthodox Jew. What do traditional Jews think of that position?
Well, this was the mainstream view of Jewish people worldwide, whether it was...
well, I know it was. It isn't now. So what do they tell you now?
Well, what they've done is let's just talk about the religious point of view, because we're talking about the Judaism, not people who have left the folds of Judaism.
Right.
The Jewish view is that the mainstream view would be that, true, we shouldn't be having a state, but once it's created, the Zionist propaganda that the Arabs want to throw every Jew into the ocean, and there's an ingrained hate against the Jews, which they've convinced many Jews to believe. This is why they are fearful of returning the land.
Well, you can't blame them, right? I mean, you have the president of Iran who says the Holocaust never existed, and if he had his druthers, he'd destroy Israel and all the Jews.
That's also patently false. He has a Jewish community in Iran, and they haven't murdered them when they had the opportunity.
So you don't take him at his word that he would try to kill Jews?
He would want to the dismantling of the political state of Israel. In fact, we went a whole group of rabbis this last year year to visit Iran, and we were taken up by the leaders. We met with the vice president. He was in Venezuela at the time. We met with the religious leaders. All of them stated that unequivocally that they don't have a conflict with the religion.
So as long as Israel exists, Rabbi, you think you're just itching for trouble. Right?
The Jews are suffering, the Palestinians, the Lebanese are suffering. We pray for the speedy and peaceful dismantlement of this